Chapter 20. The school bus came and went, its yellow sides and empty windows splattered with muck. Jim heard it pass from somewhere just under the surface of sleep filled with running, and Poochie barking, and Fisher shouting, and Ruth Rose's eyes filled with hatred. It was noon when he woke up, his head woozy, his body aching all over. He lay in bed, startled by the gray daylight like water wrung from a sponge mop. He wondered where he was. Snoot, beside him, rolled over to have her tummy rubbed. Jim complied. Before his waking eyes, he saw again the look of loathing Ruth Rose had hurled at him when she left. Betrayal. That's what he had seen, though he had been too enraged to recognize it. Betrayal? Surely she was the one who had betrayed him, vandalized his home. Or had she? She had the motive, she had the time, but if she had done it, she had not given anything away at Billy Bones or on the walk home. Was that part of her illness? Could she do something like that and completely forget it had ever happened? Jim had heard of such things, but he couldn't believe it. So what if she really hadn't done it? But then, why didn't she defend herself when he accused her? She even flung it in his face. Hey, Jim, you gotta admit, this is a great idea. What else had she said? It's just perfect. What did that mean? His mind was working overtime as he pulled on his tatty robe and slippers. He peeked into the spare room. Ruth Rose's bedclothes were all over the place. He picked up her pillow and held it close to his face, sniffing. The pillow was cold, with no lingering smell of roses. No wonder. The window had been wide open all night. The wind had blown her away. He closed it. In the kitchen, his mother sat at the table, fixing the phone cable. Hub's red toolbox lay open beside a plate of scarcely touched toast. She looked up, but there was only warmed-over comfort in her dark eyes. He wondered if she had slept at all. She looked back down at her work. When I've got this done, I'm calling the police, unless you've got a better idea, she said. Maybe you could call Heck instead, he said. She looked at him curiously, as if there were more secrets. It's just a suggestion. On the counter, he found a paper bag from the baker with 3 Danish pastries inside. The paper bag was smeared with red paint. There was red paint everywhere. She reconnected the phone, then called the factory to let them know she wouldn't be coming in that night. I'm going into town, she said. I don't care if I have to spend our last cent. I'm not going to live in this house with this. She couldn't go on. Didn't need to. The kitchen spoke for itself, no less dreadful by noonlight. Jim tried to keep his voice calm, sensible sounding. Mom, he said, this is going to sound weird, but I'm not sure Ruth Rose did this. His mother's face skewed up in an expression of disgust. Are you out of your mind? Jim took a deep breath. Maybe, he said. His mother slammed the tools back into the toolbox. So you are suggesting he did this? Maybe. His mother stared at him. What kind of a lunatic would accuse himself of murder in the house of a victim? As impossible as it seemed, Jim thought he knew exactly what kind of a lunatic. Don't you see, he said, urgently now. He's talked to you about her. He knows that you know that she thinks she murdered Dad. So this graffiti doesn't tell you anything new. Jim gave up. It sounded ridiculous. Jim, said his mother, think of what you are saying. I am. No, you're not. She's completely bamboozled you. She's kidnapped your mental faculties. No, she hasn't. Stop, said Iris, holding up her hand. Her face was flushed. She stood up, slammed shut the steel top of the toolkit. She glared at him. Then she reached for her phone again and punched a number. Heck, please, she said, glancing Jim's way. Heck was out on a call. It's urgent, Dorothy, said Iris. Please tell him to call as soon as he gets back. Jim watched as his mother hung up and started to punch in another set of numbers, then hesitated and hung up. So, no police, not yet. And he knew why. They'd had enough police a year ago to last them a lifetime. Jim made to speak, but she held up her hand. Save it, she said. He took a seat across the table from her. He tried to compose himself for whatever was coming next. He watched her wipe her eyes with her hand, pinch the bridge of her nose. When she opened her eyes, they were bloodshot, but looked upon him gently nonetheless. Jim, she said, remember at church when you came back after so long? Remember how people looked at you? He remembered all right. Some of that, Jim, was sympathy for losing your father, but some of it was for something else. Jim cast her a curious look. A lot of people, were worried about you, she said. You were not well for quite a while there, you remember? We weren't sure what you might do. Jim bowed his head. That's all past, he said. I told you. I know, Jim, or at least I thought I did. Jim looked at her with drawing awareness. You think I'm nuts? He said. His mother shook her head. I don't know what to think. Yes, you do, he said. You think I've lost it, like I'm having delusions. Hey, maybe I did this, he shouted, holding his hands to take in the defiled kitchen. Iris looked stressed. Talking like that is only making things worse. Suddenly Jim knew what it must be like to be Ruth Rose, to always be under a cloud of suspicion, to never be accepted at face value. As soon as he knew she was under medication, that she had been institutionalized, you could never be sure. And Father had made sure everybody knew that. Then he recalled something Fisher had said about Jim being sick, about it running in the family. Hey, maybe I'm like Dad, he said. Iris sighed. That's what Fisher said last night. I have the same thing Dad has. He didn't say that, said Iris fiercely. How would you know, said Jim. You weren't here. Then he dropped his voice. Or maybe it wasn't Fisher. Maybe my voice has told me that. Jim, Iris pushed her hair back off her forehead. This is no time for joking. He threatened me. You think that's a joke? Enough, said Iris. He was going to argue, but she stopped him with a steely glance. She closed her eyes. Without opening them again, she said, I'm going to the hardware store. You think you'll be okay here alone? Jim thought of something smart-ass to say, but kept it to himself. I'll be okay, he said. I can start cleaning up. When Heck phones, I'll ask him to come up here. He watched her closely, wondered whether he had sounded sane enough. She nodded, smiled, and without another word went upstairs to change. She left with only a hug and a promise to hurry back. She wasn't gone more than a few minutes when Heck called. Jimbo, he said, his voice wound up tight. I just heard that your mother called, but I'm glad you're there. I was on the verge of calling you. You were? I'm out at the Sagittarius Motel, near the 511 turnoff. There's something I want to talk to you about. Tell your mom I can be up there in 15 minutes. 17 minutes later, Heck's behemoth old Buick splashed into the yard, looking a bit like a tank and sounding like one, too. It was slathered with mud, basted with it. Hector Protector had waded into battle at a terribly fast pace. Jim was out in the yard in time to hold the door open as the elderly journalist climbed out of his car. What's up? Heck's eyes were shining. Things are hopping all over. With a hand in the small of Jim's back, he started to propel him, grandfatherly fashion, towards the house, but Jim stopped him in his tracks. You better tell me out here, Jim said. Heck looked towards the house, but he didn't push for an explanation. Where's Iris? She'll be back in an hour or so. Heck's bushy eyebrows came together in a frown. What was it you wanted to talk to me about? Jim added hurriedly. It was clear that Heck was full of news, but he looked at Jim a moment, the way he might look at a blank page before starting to write a story. I'm a newspaperman, born and bred, and I've come to believe that there isn't any such thing as a coincidence. He paused, and Jim wondered if he was supposed to say something, but Heck was only composing his story. When you were in the expositor office a couple weeks back, you were looking up the fire that took the life of the Tufts lad. Francis, right. Now, what would you say if I told you Stanley Tufts was in the neighborhood? His brother? None other, said Heck. I picked up a call on the police band first thing this morning about some trouble at the Sagittarius Motel, and the trouble had to do with Stanley Tufts. But they moved, said Jim, down south. Heck nodded. The address in the motel registry was Baton Rouge, Louisiana. What kind of trouble? Asked Jim. Heck stuck his hands in his pants pocket. Trashed his room, took off. Except he didn't take off in his own car. His rental was still sitting right out front, and he left all his stuff behind at the scene of the crime. Heck paused for dramatic effect, including some blood. Jim shook his head in wonderment. It didn't sound like the kind of thing that happened in Ladybank. I find myself contemplating, said Heck, whether you might be able to shed some light on why Stanley Tufts was around here a few weeks after you looked up that story. Jim stared off for a moment, his head buzzing. I don't know, he said. He scratched his head. Maybe. Heck took off his glasses and cleaned them with the end of his tie. He put them back on his nose and squinted at Jim. Jim grabbed him by the cuff of his sports jacket and led him towards the kitchen. Heck stood amazed on the threshold. "What in God's sweet name is this all about?" he murmured. So Jim led him outside to where the kitchen table now stood on the lawn, sat him down on a chair, and, as best he could, told him what had happened. He tried to stick to the facts, but whenever he got off track, Heck was quick to steer him back on course in a manner that embarrassed and somehow reassured Jim at the same time. When Jim was done, Heck looked at him for a long time, as if the boy were some rare specimen of beetle and Heck was a scientist trying to figure out what genus he belonged to. "Stanley Tufts, blackmailer?" he said at long last. He didn't roll his eyes, but Jim felt suddenly like a child playing at make-believe. "Maybe he saw something the night of the fire," said Jim. But Heck shook his head. "They'd already moved down to Brockville," he said. "I went back and read the report in the X myself. Stanley would have been, 10 or so. Doubt he was up this way alone." "Yes, sir," said Jim, dropping his head to hide the blush of embarrassment. Then he remembered something else, something that was fact. Fisher, last night, he looked like he'd been in a fight. Now, Heck looked plainly distrustful. Jim quickly realized his mistake. I don't know if it was a fight, but he had a cut on his face, right here. He painted a line along his right cheekbone. And the collar of his coat was kind of wet with something, and there were scratches on his neck, and he didn't have his cross on, the one he always wears. At this, Heck looked genuinely interested. He put his hands on his splayed knees, thumbs out, and leaned forward. "Crucifix, you mean?" "Yes, sir." "What did this crucifix look like?" Jim described it. Heck pondered something for a moment, looking out over the sopping lawn. "Mind if I use your phone?" he asked. Jim followed him inside and stood at a respectful distance, but not so far that he couldn't hear what Heck was saying. Heck was phoning the police. Chief Lorne Braithwaite had been the rookie cop who had arrested Francis for arson back in '67, Jim recalled, and it was Constable Braithwaite who had been the first at the site of the fire in '72. Another coincidence, but not a big one in such a small town. "He's not in? Still up the scene, eh? No, that's all right. I'll catch up with him." Heck hung up. He took one last sad look at the graffiti that defiled the kitchen and shook his head. Jim walked him out to the car. "You stay around, Jimbo," he said. "I've a feeling the chief will want to talk to you real soon." Heck patted his hand and wheeled out of the yard. Jim was already at work in the kitchen when his mother arrived home. He had unscrewed some shelves, taken down the curtains, removed whatever he could. He went to meet Iris in the yard to help her carry her purchases. Among other things, she had rented a floor sander. They set to work. Jim let the job at hand claim his whole attention. His mother didn't look like she wanted to talk. Cleaning seemed to be what she had in mind. Together, they manhandled the fridge and the stove into the parlor. Then she put on a pair of ear protectors and flipped on the sander. She had only been at it for 5 minutes when Jim cupped his hands and shouted at her to stop. The phone was ringing. It was Heck. Ruth Rose had been arrested.